Now, you mentioned term limits, and this is something that has come up in other branches of government. We saw in North Dakota legislation, local legislation, I should note, setting a maximum age for folks running for office there. It's obviously been in the news with President Biden's health and age as he runs for reelection. Does the political climate that we're in right now make that a more bipartisan issue and something that is more a piece of reform that is more likely to pass?
Well, it used to have pretty broad bipartisan support. And the important thing to understand about term limits, I think, is it's not really a response to the problem of people getting too old. That would be an age limit. And it would be a little bit ironic maybe for Biden to be pushing for term limits on that basis. And it's not even really a response to the problem of people serving for too long, although I think there is an issue with justices serving for 30 or even 40 years. The real problem that term limits is supposed to address is about the composition of the Supreme Court and the influence that each president has over the Supreme Court. So under our current system, how many appointments does a president get? No one knows. It could be 0, like Jimmy Carter. It could be 3 in one term, like Donald Trump. And how much influence a president has over the Supreme Court is sort of random. It's affected by whether a justice unexpectedly dies, and it's sort of controlled by the justices themselves because they usually time their retirements so that their replacement will be appointed by a president who shares their values. So what that means is there's no predictable way in which the composition of the Supreme Court is tied to anything other than random chance and partisan behavior. And that's just not a good way to decide which of our two political parties gets to control the Supreme Court. So the founders, when they drafted the Constitution, they weren't thinking about political parties. They didn't imagine that two parties would be fighting for the Supreme Court as a power center within the government. But that's what's happening now. And everyone understands it does matter who the justices are. It matters whether a Democrat or a Republican appoints them. So it would make a lot more sense if we had a system where if you win a national election, right, the Democrats win the presidency, they get to put 2 justices on the Supreme Court. And the point of term limits is if you take the justices off or move them to senior status or something like that every 18 years, so that each justice has an active term of 18 years, then with a 9-member court, you get 2 vacancies per presidential term. Each president gets to appoint 2 justices per 4-year term, and that way each president has an equal impact on the composition of the Supreme Court. And I think that a lot of the problems that we're seeing now come from the fact that the court is so out of step with the American people. And it's out of step because we've got a 6-3 Republican supermajority, even though the Republicans have lost 5 of the last 8 presidential elections. So term limits is really a sort of structural fix to that problem.